RN. Scott Morrison is the Shadow Immigration Minister and he joins me in the Parliament House studios. Scott Morrison, welcome.
Thank you, Fran. Good to be with you.
Labor says it will need $2.9 billion to manage asylum seekers next year. If you win the election, what number would you be putting on it?
Well, at this stage, we've got 23,000 people in the detention network. We've got arrivals running at 21,000 plus, I suspect, by the end of this financial year. Very few of those have been actually processed. So there'll be a very large Labor legacy of people onshore. And a vast bulk of what's in that budget that the government's announced is to deal with the people who are already here. So
there is money for the onshore costs, though.
But that's my point. The onshore costs are within that budget, and that's to deal with the 23,000 people who are already in the system here onshore. Now, they have to be processed. The government hasn't processed them, so there is a big backlog to clear. Our concern particularly is in the years beyond the $3 billion that they've budgeted for next year, where they've forecast a decline in arrivals, taking it down to, we estimate, somewhere at about 10% of what it is today. Now, the basis for that is just completely absurd. Even next year with
10% of what it is, aren't they talking about 13,000? Well, that's not going to be
No, this
10.
is the end of the projections. So at the end of the out years, they're saying they're going to use the 10-year average, and that's where they'll end up. Now, if it's a 10-year average to the end of 11-12, that's about 2,300 people. If it's to the end of 12-13, it's about 4,000 people.
Well, I guess we don't know, and perhaps this is the department factoring in that you might be in government and perhaps your policies will work as you claim they will.
I've never seen a government budget on a change in government before, Fran. If that's what you're suggesting, I think that would be quite extraordinary.
As Immigration Minister, though, if that is your job after the election, and we don't know what will happen, but if you were in that position, will you be trusting the figures your department gives you?
Well, I haven't been able to trust what this government has put forward for their arrivals forecasts over the last 5 years. And because of those failed forecasts, the government has blown out their budget over that time since they abolished the Howard government measures by more than $10 billion now. The latest budget blowout in this budget is $4.1 billion, and that was just from February. So
it's funny to call it talk about trust and blowout in something like this, though, because of course no government, wouldn't matter who's in government, is not going to be able to know how many people are going to seek refuge here as asylum here, are they?
This government has always budgeted on them having solved the problem, and they've never got close to solving the problem. And every single year they say there'll be less people coming, and every single year there's more. Every single year they say it'll cost X, and it always costs X plus, 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 plus. And every time we've said this at every budget, the government has underestimated the impact of their failed policies, and it's been proven time and time again. And in this latest budget, $4.1 billion blowout just since the MYEFO in February, that's the biggest one of all.
It is the biggest one of all, and the lower estimate that's been updated now was predicated in part on the measures outlined by the Prime Minister's expert panel report being fully implemented, which includes the Malaysia transfer agreement. Now, the Minister says, and I'm quoting here, you, the opposition, can't complain about the costs associated with the arrival rate while continuing to stand in the way of measures recommended by the experts like the Malaysia agreement.
Well, this Minister has been making excuses for doing nothing since the day he got on the job as the Prime Minister. And I'll give you an example.
But the department thought that the Malaysia solution would work.
The department thought they could get the East Timor proposal up. The department thought they could get any number of things to work, and they were unsuccessful in those matters. But let me give you an example of something from the Houston report. The excision bill. It currently sits in the Senate. It's been there since February. That was a recommendation of the Houston panel. We supported it in the House of Representatives immediately.
Is that going to do anything to change the numbers coming?
That was one of the Houston panel's recommendations that have been supported by both sides of politics, and it sits in the Senate because the government is sitting on its hands and couldn't be bothered. I mean, the government simply doesn't have a sense of urgency around these things.
Well, it was pretty urgent about the Malaysia solution, and you were quite clear you weren't going to pass it.
Well, remember what the Houston panel recommended, and remember what they said. They said the Houston panel said that the Malaysian panel had insufficient protections, and they said the government had to fix those protections before it could proceed. The government hasn't lifted a finger to do that. That was August last year.
Well, but are you suggesting that if the government was serious about it and did do the work to look at the conditions in Malaysia, the coalition might support it?
What I'm saying is that the government has sat on its hands. I mean, it's a matter for the government. They've been their own proposal.
But why would they waste time doing it if you say it's a no-go?
They say they want to implement the recommendations, but they actually haven't implemented even a recommendation that would enable it to be considered by the Parliament. And so, look, that's a matter for the government. What they're doing is using the Malaysian people swap as an excuse to do nothing. And if you think about what their suggestion is, the only measure that they haven't moved on, which is the Malaysian people swap, and they haven't taken the actions that the Houston panel said they should, that is the only one. Everything else is in the process of being implemented. So their proposition is this. They think if they can send 800 people to Malaysia, this stops. Now that's absurd. 800 people turned up in the first 4 days of May.
It's 8:11 on breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Shadow Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison, one thing from the expert panel that the government got moving on very quickly was the offshore processing changes, setting up detention centres on Nauru and Manus Island. This is essentially your policies. This is what you were urging the government to do. This is very expensive. I'm presuming you support the extra money, the blowout in the budget for the asylum seeker spending. That does represent the spending on these centres.
Well, it's a fraction of the blowout, frankly. I mean, there are about
it's quite a significant amount.
No, this is about 650 people that are in offshore processing at the moment, and there are 23,000 people in the system altogether.
No, but the cost of offshore processing much more expensive, and they have to build the centres.
There was about a $300 million capital expenditure that was put in the supplementary estimates last year. But the overall boost in the budget that the government has done in this budget is to deal with the unprecedented level of arrivals. I mean, that's what drives the cost here. What drives the cost here is more people coming. I remember back in late 2011, the government said, oh, well, it'll cost less because we're going to put people in the community. That's when the costs doubled because the arrivals doubled. Arrivals drive the costs at the end of the day. And failure to process and get people through the system drives the cost. And that's why the government is putting a big legacy out there to the other side of the election, because there will be possibly up to 30,000 people in the system not processed. That is an enormous backlog.
And your pledge is to basically stop the arrivals. You say we'll stop the boats. If you win the election and implement your policy, how soon do you think you'll see a reduction in boat arrivals?
Well, we'll have to wait and see, Fran, but our commitment is to implement our policies immediately. We want to see that happen as soon as possible, and we will put to the ultimate test on that if we're elected this time at a subsequent election. I mean, we've been pretty clear about our objective here. We have over a long period of time. We've said clearly what we're going to do, and people will be able to judge our performance on that, and I'm sure everybody in the media will too.
But it's the problem I was referring to earlier. Clarity on your objection, on your objective is doesn't necessarily translate into clarity on the budget, because if you don't know how soon the boats are going to stop, you can't do your budget predictions.
Well,
clearly.
That's why I make the point that I think the government's forecast, particularly over the out years, where they're saying arrivals will fall by around about 90%, is absurd, and they're claiming savings that they would never achieve. But that said, the first challenge we will have is to work through the backlog onshore. And how long that takes, it's pretty hard to say at this moment, because there could be another 7,000.
What would you do?
To work through the backlog.
Yeah.
Basically, you've got to get people processed. You've got to get them through the system and to the other side of a decision. And as I said, potentially 30,000 people to work that system through onshore. We're not even talking about offshore, we're talking about onshore, because the vast majority of people who are coming are not ending up in offshore processing. I mean, it isn't a universal policy of offshore processing. It is an exception, not the rule, and that's one of the reasons why it's failing.
It's 8:15 on breakfast. Scott Morrison, just a couple of issues we've been discussing previously on the program this morning. One is the fact that the disability levy, the levy to pay for disability care, went through yesterday morning in the Parliament. It was very noticeable, I thought, that the coalition benches were empty for that. Kevin Andrews was there to represent the opposition, but no one else. Why?
Well, the government benches were pretty empty too, Fran.
Well,
there were a few stark in there. There wasn't a full chamber, I can assure you of that.
Wasn't.
And so to suggest that it wasn't just coalition MPs, and
I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting it was stark. There was Kevin Andrews. I couldn't see anyone else.
It was a pretty busy day yesterday, Fran. Budget week always is, and the coalition has given that full support, as you know. And any attempt by the Prime Minister to try and drive some suggestion that the coalition doesn't give that support by making references to those sorts of things, I think is a pretty cheap shot.
Well, to be fair, I don't know the Prime Minister has made that cheap shot. I was just observing that, and given that the extent that the coalition...
I think it is a cheap shot then, Fran.
Well, the coalition members were at pains yesterday to say how they support this bipartisan support. If you were looking on from the disability sector, I just think it seems a little strange.
Well, they should be in no doubt about our commitment to this, and if we're elected, we're the ones who will actually have to make it happen. I mean, the Prime Minister can make these grand promises before election, but on the other side of an election, if a coalition is elected, we're the ones who will actually have to deliver it. And it's
this was the funding mechanism
and this
to
is
do
the
that.
deliver, and there's a vote on these things, Fran, and the vote is what matters. And the support of the coalition in this matter has been consistent. I mean, we have at every stage facilitated this process, at every single stage, only to face a Prime Minister and a government that has sought to create political wedges over this. And I think that's been very unfortunate.
And just briefly on another matter, the coalition, I read today, is also denying a Labor MP, Michelle Rowland, a pair to head back to home to look after her 14-month-old baby who's not well. You're a dad. Do you think that Michelle Rowland should be allowed to go home if a baby's sick?
I'm not aware of the circumstances of that, Fran, and
But
I'm not involved
what
in
would you
those.
reckon?
I'm not involved in those matters, so it's not really one I can comment on, not being familiar with the details of this. I do know yesterday that the Labor Party broke a pair on the basis of someone saying they needed to be with their wife, and that member turned up in the chamber and voted, and the Labor Party broke a pair. So, people have to act consistently and with integrity here, and if the government is going to break pairs when they make the sort of claims that they need people to be somewhere else at a particular time and then they don't do that, well, I'll leave it to others to make the judgment. But those are matters that are handled by our whips and our Leader of Opposition Business.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Fran.
Scott Morrison is the Shadow Immigration Minister. You're listening to RM Breakfast. It's 8:17.
RN